Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming back to this advanced seminar in critical semiotics, which is offered to the graduate school of Shanghai University. My name is Massimo LEONE. I'm your professor. We have already met during the first lesson. We have introduced the concept of ideology, critical semiotics. We have talked about the mindset that is behind the discipline itself since its beginning in ancient Greece. We have talked about the sign, semeion, in ancient Greek as the main conceptual object that is the product of this mindset. Today we're going to dwell on a very important difference, the difference between language ideology or linguistic ideology, as it has been studied especially by the so-called Chicago School of Linguistic Anthropology, from Michael Silverstein to Webb Keen, from Robert Yelley in the Semiotics of Religion to Richard Parmentier, and the concept, the more encompassing concept of semiotic ideology. What is the difference between an ideology of language and a semiotic ideology? We're going to look into this difference through an example. Sorry, there was a moment of a technical issue with the connection. So let me give you an example. Behind myself in my study, you see a bookshelf, and of course this bookshelf is full of books. You have probably seen many bookshelves behind the back of professors during online courses, because this is now customary. To have this background, as if the fact of having a bookshelf in the back of the professor teaching online was somehow reassuring students about his or her competence. And these are products of verbal language, so these books are composed of sentences, which are composed of words, which are composed of letters, and these are results of verbal language. But you see, in my background, you also see something, an object, a cultural item, which is not a product of verbal language. It's a poster, it's a cinema poster of a very famous Italian movie by a director who's probably the most famous Italian director ever. He won many Oscars, many Academy Awards. His name was Federico Fellini. This is one of his most famous movies, called La Dolce Vita, The Sweet Life, with Marcello Mastroianni, who was a very famous actor in the 1960s in Italy. And this poster is not verbal only. Of course, there is the title of the movie, but there is also a picture with the face of the actor, there is a graphic style, there is a position of the elements within the frame, and so on and so forth. So this is a very silly example to let you know that in semiotics, when we talk about language, we talk about the general faculty of human beings of patterning reality, of patterning the environment through signs, through signifying structures. And a specific but very important, very central subspecies in this all-encompassing category is verbal language. But semiotics is not about verbal language only, because otherwise, why should we talk about semiotics and not simply about linguistics? What is the difference between linguistics and semiotics? You know, many of you might have studied linguistics already, but linguistics usually concentrates on verbal language only. Even sociolinguistics, which is the study of the social environment of language, concentrates on the social environment of verbal language only. Semiotics goes beyond linguistics. So this is something that you find already in one of the first definitions of semiotics, semiotics as semiology, the name that was coined, that was created by Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, when he first inaugurated the idea of this new science. You know, Ferdinand de Saussure, as you might know, was a famous linguist. He is the founding father of structuralism in linguistics. He is also the father of a very revolutionary idea in the study of language. You see, before Ferdinand de Saussure, many linguists would not be linguists in the modern meaning of the term. They would study language as an expression of the soul, as an expression of the personality. They would study language as it is found in literature, in poetry. So they would carry on an impressionistic study of language, not a scientific study of language. Ferdinand de Saussure is one of the first scholars who actually thought that language was not something to be studied only in the framework of poetry or literature or philosophy, like romantic philosophy, but it was actually an object of scientific investigation. You know, Ferdinand de Saussure came from a family of naturalists. You know, his father was a famous natural sciences scholar, and he conceived of language as an object for a sort of a scientific investigation. So he was the first one, or among the first ones, to promote the approach according to which language is not to be studied as an expression of one's interiority, but on the contrary, language is to be studied in its own structures, in its own features, in its own rules and regularities. You know, this is the very origin, the nutshell of the idea, mindset, epistemology of structuralism. So Ferdinand de Saussure initiating this new approach of the study of language. He also thought that this approach should not limit itself to verbal language only. This is how he first defined semiology. Ferdinand de Saussure thought, okay, there is verbal language, and verbal language is an object for scientific, systematic investigation. But verbal language is not isolated. It is actually surrounded by a society that works through different systems of science. Signs are everywhere, and only some of these signs are actually part of verbal language. Just think about a normal web page that you come across during a navigation through the internet. You see, let me share something with you. If you go to this web page, which is a web page in Spanish, which is part of the website of my research project on facets. As I told you during the last lesson, I am the principal investigator of a project which is called Facets, Face Aesthetics in Contemporary Technological Societies. And this project is all about the face, how the face looks and means in contemporary societies. And in this website, I try to collect information, news, and investigation results about the face. Now, this is something that I've just uploaded. It's actually an article about a woman called Anna Coleman. Anna Coleman was an artist, was a US artist who had a very special preoccupation. She had a very peculiar, specific mission. You see, she lived mainly after the First World War, World War I, and after this terrible, tremendous, horrific war, there were many veterans, there were many soldiers who had survived the war, but nevertheless had been tremendously, horrifically wounded, and especially they had been wounded in their faces. Their faces had been disfigured by bombs, by bullets, by other weapons. And so the life of these veterans, of these soldiers that who had been wounded in the First World War was terrible, because they didn't have a face anymore. They had a face, but this face was completely disfigured. They couldn't show themselves with the face that they had before the war. And these soldiers, these veterans, would live terrible lives because they would be ashamed of showing their completely disfigured, destroyed faces, and so they would live secluded. They would hardly get a job. They would be ashamed also of reconnecting with their own families. And at that time, plastic surgery was still very primitive. So this woman, this artist, Anna Coleman, had the idea of creating some artificial faces for these soldiers, for these veterans who had lost their faces, whose faces had been disfigured during the war. And so she started molding them, molding these faces, and creating first some molds, as you see, of visages, faces of the soldiers, of the veterans, as they were, so as they were disfigured and wounded. But then she would also try to recreate the original faces of these veterans through a sculpture, through painting, through all the arts that she knew. Because her idea was to restore the faces of these veterans through the arts. And she was very in demand after World War I. She moved to Paris, where there were many war veterans, and war veterans would go to her by hundreds, and very patiently she would recreate faces. And of course these faces, these artificial faces, were very primitive, meaning that they only had one expression. But you know, this woman, this artist, Anna Coleman, was very clever, because she had to choose only one expression for these masks. And so she studied the character, she studied also the personality of the veteran, she studied the pictures of these veterans before their faces they would be wounded in the war, and she would select one single face with one single appearance, sometimes with a mustache, as it is the case in this picture, that would somehow represent the face of the soldier. Now, you cannot understand this phenomenon from the point of view of verbal language only. Of course, we can describe the face through words. In novels, in poetry, in literature, you find many descriptions of faces. But nevertheless, there is also a grammar of the face, a grammar of the visage, which is not a verbal grammar, it is a visual grammar. It is the grammar that gives meaning to our faces when we talk, when we interact with other human being, to our expressions, to our emotions. So this is just a simple example to let you know that it is actually important to consider that when semiology was first invented by Ferdinand de Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure conceived it exactly as an expansion of linguistics. He thought that linguistics was the systematic study of a language in society, but at the same time the systematic study of verbal language should be accompanied also by the study of other systems of science. And in the first important work of Ferdinand de Saussure, the course of general linguistics, he gave several examples. He gave the examples of the usage of flags, for instance, in navigation, the usage of drums to transmit messages, and so on and so forth. So, why am I saying all this? Why am I emphasizing the difference between language as a general faculty of the human being and verbal language, as distinguished from visual language, musical language, architectural language, and so on and so forth? Well, I'm stressing this difference because this is important in order to understand that what we talked about last lesson, the idea, the concept of a language ideology, should now be expanded to the more general and more encompassing concept of semiotic ideology. Semiotic ideology. So this is an important passage, the passage from language ideology to semiotic ideology. What is the difference? Well, as I told you, the concept of language ideology emerged especially in the Chicago School of Linguistic Anthropology by a series of anthropologists, by a group of anthropologists who wanted to point out the conditions of working of language, meaning verbal language, in a certain community. So these anthropologists were interested in who was speaking in a community, who was speaking first, what power is associated to the fact that someone is speaking, and so on and so forth. And there are countless examples. You see, unfortunately now we have this terrible situation with the virus, but otherwise in the past I would come to China, to Shanghai, at least 3 times per year and stay long periods of time in Shanghai. And during these periods of time I was also kindly invited by many of my colleagues and professors to dinners and meals with other professors. And it was very interesting for me, a foreigner, a Westerner, to observe from a semiotic point of view these dinners, because many things would happen during these dinners and I was not completely able in the beginning to decode all of these events. Why? Well, because first of all, I didn't know the language, of course. This is a big barrier. I didn't know Chinese. But in some circumstances, that was not a problem because there was an interpreter, but also because my colleagues would be so kind to speak English to me. So in that circumstance, when everybody was speaking English, the problem was not the language anymore. What I was not understanding was not a matter of verbal language. What I was not understanding was something else. It was the other signs, the other systems of science that were involved into this particular situation that was a meal or a dinner with my colleagues. So now you help me. Maybe we'll talk about it during the discussion as well. But as I go as an Italian professor, as a Westerner, as a foreigner, I go to a dinner with my Chinese colleagues, and of course, you know, we talk. I talk in English with some Chinese, of course, but immediately as I go to the restaurant, there are many new signs and systems of signs that I must decode in order to understand what is going on. For instance, I go to this dinner, and the first question I have to face at this dinner is, where is it that I'm going to sit? What is my place? Where is my place at the table? Because the code is different in the West and in the East. It's different in China and in Italy. In Italy, I will go to the restaurant, and the shape of the table normally would not be round. So tables in Western restaurants, and especially in Italian restaurants, are very rarely round. Most commonly, the shape of the table is a square, or even more commonly for bigger groups of people is a rectangle. So in that circumstance, it is quite easy to understand that there is a difference between sitting at the short side of the table or sitting at the long side of the table. So just imagine a table in a restaurant, an Italian restaurant. You go to the Italian restaurant and the table is a rectangle. So it's very easy to understand for me, because I know the code, that sitting at the long side of the table or sitting at the short side of the table will have a different meaning, a different connotation. Why? Well, because I know, as an Italian speaker, but also someone who knows Italian food culture and Italian ceremonies, that if I sit at the short side of the table, immediately I will stand out. I will be different from those who will be sitting at the long side of the table. Why? Because traditionally now, in many Western countries, sitting especially alone at the short side of the table means being someone important, being someone whose importance must be underlined by the fact that this special place, this special sitting place with a specific visibility is going to be given. Now, it was not always like this in Europe. You see, maybe you have seen movies about medieval times in Italy or in Europe. You have seen movies about Renaissance and these feasts and these wonderful meals that kings and queens would offer in their castles. At that time, the semiotics of the table was different. Why? Because, well, of course, there was a very long rectangular table, but the most important seat, the most important position at the table was not on the short side, it was at the long side, because one of them was entirely dedicated to the queen, or the queen with the king, while the other side was completely empty. Why so? Because people should enter the court. We were not in a restaurant then, we were in a castle, we were in the main hall of a castle. So people would enter the main hall of the castle where the feast, where this big party, this big meal would be taking place. And so one of the long sides of the table, of the queen's and king's table, would be completely empty. And on the other long side, there would be just the queen with the king. So they would have complete visibility and a very strong position of power. They would occupy on their own, alone, not the short sides of the table, but an entire long side of the table. But now we don't have kings and queens anymore in many European societies. We go to restaurants, and when we go to restaurants, so we know that if there are 10 people and there is this rectangular table, the one who's going to be sitting at the short sides is usually a person who has a certain status. So on the 22nd, in a few days, for instance, I'm going to share a meal with my PhD students. Of course, we'll be all masked with protections and so on and so forth, and very far away from each other because there is the virus. But still, I know that probably I will be sitting at the short side of the table because I'm the professor and nobody wants to be sitting there while I'm there. But what happens when I go to the Chinese restaurant? I go to the hall. First of all, the structure of the restaurant is different, because if I get invited by professors to a meal, usually we don't go to a big hall with many tables, but in China we go to the third floor and there is a secluded little room and there is a table where only the ones participating in the dinner will be sitting. And what I see as I enter this room, this restaurant room, is a round table. It's always a round table. I've never had a dinner or a lunch or a meal with my Chinese colleagues at a table that wasn't round. So you see, this is a difference in topology, is a difference in shape, is a difference between rectangular table in the West, round table in the East, rectangular table in Italy, and round table in China. If you don't pay attention, you don't realize that this is actually not only a casualty, it's not only a detail, it is a sign, it is a signifier, it is something that points to an opposition of meanings. So you have two different shapes: square, circle, square table, round table, but this opposition of signifiers is in relation with an opposition of signified, an opposition of meanings. What are these meanings? Well, these meanings are cultural attitudes, are ideologies. There is a certain ideology behind the fact that in China all restaurants for this kind of meals are circular, are round, and there is a certain ideology also behind the fact that most restaurant tables in Italy or in the West are rectangular. But these ideologies are not simply linguistic ideology, they are not language ideology, because they do not actually concern verbal language. There is no written text in which you will find the meaning of a rectangular table in Italy or the meaning of a circular table in China. This is something that is part of common sense, it is shared knowledge, but it's not written anywhere, because it is not a knowledge concerning verbal language. It is not a knowledge that points to a language linguistic ideology. It is knowledge that points to something more general, something more encompassing, which is the semiotic ideology of a society. So what is the semiotic ideology behind a circular table? Well, of course, you can probably imagine, even if you're not a semiotician, that the semiotic ideology behind a circular table is an idea of collectivity which is stronger than individuality, once again. In China, tables, even for ceremonial meals, for meals among professors, are circular, because behind the circular table there is the idea that we should not actually stress differences among ourselves in a too emphatic way. We should not overemphasize the fact that some of us are different. This is not good in China. This is good in Italy, to a certain extent. So you will say, okay, so there are no ways to actually underlying differences in China. When you go to a meal, there are no special positions around the table. Well, that's not true, of course, because a meal after meal, dinner after dinner, lunch after lunch with my Chinese colleagues, I realized that I was always sitting at the same place. So that was not an accident, of course. There was a specific place around this round table that was actually attributed to the foreigner or to the special guest. And which one was this sitting place? Well, of course, it was usually the place that was in front of the door. So the place from which you could see the door was the place that was usually attributed to me, and then at my sides, left to right, there were the older professors, and then opposite myself there was usually the younger professors. So there was actually a language of the ways of sitting at a Chinese table during this kind of meals. You see, some of these rules, some of these grammars were also codified. There is a specific genre in Western literature which is called in manners literature. These are handbooks that were written especially in the 15th century, 16th century, and specify the rules and codes concerning manners and ceremonies, which are not actually part of verbal knowledge. There is no actual code, like a legal code or a normative code, but these rules, this shared knowledge became so important in Europe in the 15th century, in the 16th century, that someone actually wrote them down. And I'm sure that this literature exists also in China, and especially during certain historical periods. So there is a certain literature about these manners, but this literature is not like the constitution of a country, it's not like the civil code of a country, it's not like a penal code of a country. Nobody is going to arrest you in Italy if you sit at the wrong seat at the table. People will just think, okay, maybe he's a foreigner, he doesn't know, he doesn't know the rules. Because these rules are not binding norms, they just function as a watershed. They allow a distinction between insiders and outsiders, between those who know the culture, are members of it, and those who are not. But you see, you can be a member of a culture and not being aware of the semiotic ideology that is behind that culture. So you can be a Chinese person and perfectly know where the special guest is supposed to sit at the table during a lunch, during a dinner, but you might also completely ignore why. First of all, you might ignore the etymology of this rule. You might ignore why is it done so. But you might also ignore the semiotics of this rule. You might also ignore why, from the point of view of the shared meaning of a community, this is done. So you see, cultural semiotics, critical semiotics, the semiotics of ideologies is necessary also to detect, uncover, show, verbalize, make explicit all the hidden codes that are fundamental in our everyday life and that continuously tell us what is the correct, right behavior in a given circumstance. Now, of course, this is just a very silly example, because if you go to a meal with professors in Italy, or as a Chinese student or as a Chinese scholar, or vice versa. If you go to a meal or a dinner in China as an Italian student, as an Italian scholar, you'll come across a myriad of signs. And many of these signs are not actually verbal. They're not part of verbal language. They are part of other systems of signs. Postures, movements of the body, expressions on one's face, topology, let's say distance among the participants of a dinner, and so on and so forth. To give you another example, what is happening everywhere in the world, the spreading of this virus, the spreading of this pandemic, is actually modifying verbal language, because there are many new words that we use every day since the beginning of the pandemic. We use some technical words much more than before: infectious, contagious, flatten the curve, self-isolation, social distanciation, social distancing, working from place, smart working, and so on and so forth. But there are also many new words, some of them ironic, humorous, that are created because of the pandemic, after the pandemic. You see, language is one of the most important cognitive resources of human beings. Through language, human beings cope with the environment, deal with the environment, try to adapt to the environment. So if the environment changes, and especially if the environment changes fast, language has to change fast as well to adapt the environment. And so many new words were created during the pandemic because the world completely changed in a matter of few months. So some of these words are pretty funny. You see, I don't know if you drink, but in Italy, in Europe, people drink some cocktails from time to time, and some of these cocktails have special names. There is a famous cocktail in Italy, which is also the most favorite cocktail of James Bond. It's called Martini. And another famous cocktail which is drunk in Mexico is called Margarita. But you see, during this pandemic, two new words were created. One is quarantini, which is the cocktail martini that you drink at home during the quarantine, but also the Coronarita, which is the margarita that you drink at home during the pandemic due to the coronavirus. So these are just two examples, but there are many words, humorous words, that were created during this pandemic. You see the word, for instance, quarantine, which is the tan that you get by being exposed in the sun in summer, but wearing a mask. So you get a tan, but a tan with the shape of a mask, and it's called quarantine. But there is also quarantine. Quarantine is a group of people that you choose to be with during the lockdown, during the quarantine. But there is also the quarantines, which are teenagers who have been teenagers, who have become teenagers, unfortunately for them, during the quarantine. So it's a specific generation, and so on and so forth. So you see, verbal language changes during periods of crisis, but what changes is not only words. What changes is not only verbal language. Other systems of signs change too. For instance, if I were to go to China right now, it would not be possible for me to have a meal, a lunch or a dinner with my colleagues as I used to have it before. We couldn't share food. We couldn't share drinks in the same way. We should respect a completely different pattern of norms. So we're going to take a small break, and after this small break, we're going to reflect more about how these periods of crisis change not only words and verbal language, but other systems of science and the semiotic ideology that is behind these systems of science. So it is now 8:55 here, so let's say 55. We have already talked for 45 minutes. We're gonna stop now and we are gonna resume exactly at past 5, so in 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Please interrupt me at any time if you want to ask questions. I always thank Nisi Chang, the teaching assistant, for his wonderful cooperation. And we'll resume now exactly in 10 minutes, so 5 past. Thank you. So hello everybody, again. It's a pleasure to be back after this short 10-minute break. I see that among the attendees there is also now a Professor Jenny Ponceo. Professor Jenny Ponceo is a professor of semiotics with a specialization of semiotics of literature at the University of Turin, and she's going to join us with a special talk on semiotic ideologies in literature and in semiotics of literary texts in the third part of our course. But in the meantime, I say hello to her before she's actually properly introduced by me at the beginning of the third term. I've also received a question that I read for everyone, but you can see it in the chat. Would you please explain more about the work of Anna Coleman? Does she provide artificial faces to someone who lost his or her face during World War I? And comparing to the verbal grammar, this kind of artificial faces are visual grammar, right? Verbal language grammar help people to decode the meanings of the sentences, so these kind of artificial faces help people to identify some information of certain person. I don't know if it is correct. Would you please talk about it more? Thanks. Well, thank you very much. This is very insightful. It's a very a clever comment. Indeed, Anna Coleman was mainly a sculptor and a painter. Now, you must know something in order for me to be able to reply to these questions. Anatomy, which is the systematic study of the human body, is a branch of natural sciences and a branch of medicine that a fully developed as a scientific endeavor, especially from the 16th, 17th century on. And why did it develop, especially from these particular centuries on, particularly from the 17th century on? We're talking about 1600 on. Well, because a new instrument was invented in the 17th century. A new instrument that was fundamental in order to develop a new systematic knowledge of the human body. This instrument is the microscope. So two fundamental instruments of modern natural sciences, the microscope and the telescope, were both invented around the first quarter of the 17th century, and they were invented because new techniques were developed in order to produce lenses that are fundamental in order to magnify an image and to allow our eyes to see something that we could not possibly see with our naked eyes. So something that is very small through the microscope, but also something that is very far through the telescope. The microscope allowed naturalists and natural scientists to look into the body in ways that were unprecedented. I'm gonna make a very simple example. You see, we all have a particular feature in our fingers. It's called fingerprints. Finger rings appear at the tips of our fingers, at our fingertips, and they're called fingerprints. You know that fingerprints are and have been fundamental for a long time in order to identify people. And now they're being replaced more and more by face recognition, by the so-called face print. But for a very long period of time, fingerprints have been fundamental and are still fundamental. You know, in many airports around the world, you must leave your fingerprints before you can move on. Although in China, which is a country which is now probably the most advanced, technologically advanced country in the world, you can go through the airport by showing your face and not by showing your fingerprints. By the way, fingerprints were first used to identify people in China. In the 3rd century before Christ, China was already using fingerprints in trials in order to identify people. But anyway, before the invention of the microscope, anatomists, a naturalist, did not actually know that fingerprints existed. They knew that we have these particular rings at the tips of our fingers, but they didn't know that they are individual, they are singular, they are different for each person. And we are in the 17th century. Why? Because the invention of the microscope was actually necessary for naturalists to realize it. If you look at engravings, drawings, paintings that were executed before, if you look at the drawings by Albrecht Dürer, for instance, or the paintings by Leonardo, well, of course, they would paint or draw finger rings, but they wouldn't actually represent exact fingerprints. They didn't know that they were there. Nevertheless, why am I saying all this? I'm saying all this because before the invention of the microscope, the ones who would know and study the human body with more depth, at least in Western history, were not doctors, were not anatomists, were not natural scientists. People who would actually know the human body and the anatomy of the human body were mainly artists. Artists, and especially painters, were the first ones to try to know the details of the human body and to investigate also what is underneath the human skin. So you probably know that one of the most famous artists in world history, world art history, is an Italian artist called Leonardo. And Leonardo used to take or even steal sometimes corpses, so dead human bodies, from hospitals and dissect them, open them as if he was a surgeon, because he wanted to know how the body was structured inside, because he wanted to know what was underneath, beneath the skin. Why? Well, not because he was a doctor, not because he was a natural scientist. He was also a natural scientist, but his main purpose was another one. He wanted to represent, to paint the human body as well as possible, as proficiently as possible. He wanted to color the skin in his paintings in a very realistic way. And in order to correctly paint or sculpt the human being, it was necessary to know not only the exteriority of the body, but also how the body would look inside, how the muscles, the tendons, the bones, the blood vessels were arranged. So why this long introduction? This long introduction is necessary to let you know that right now, if we had a terrible accident, God forbid, and our face would be disfigured, we would immediately think, okay, I'm going to go to a plastic surgeon, I'm going to go to a surgeon who is a specialist in reconstructive surgery. But even soon after World War I, there was plastic surgery, there was reconstructive surgery, but reconstructive surgery was still focusing on other parts of the bodies. It was focusing on limbs, for instance. So, who were the specialists in the construction and reconstruction of faces? It wasn't surgeons, it wasn't plastic surgeons. The specialists in this reconstruction were the artists. The artists, the painters, the specialists in drawing, but also the sculpture. The sculptors would know how to invent a face, how to create an artificial face, how to restore also a face. You know, restoring is a very ancient practice of Western art history. Restoring the face of sculptures, restoring the faces of portraits, and so on and so forth. So it should not come as a surprise that after World War I, it was a woman who was not a surgeon, who was not a doctor. She was an artist, and she was the first one actually to have the idea that in order to help these soldiers, in order to help these veterans, one should go through a special reconstruction, which was not the reconstruction of limbs, not the arms, not the legs, but the reconstruction of the face. Now, does the face has a grammar? Of course it has a grammar. You see, this is something that you recognize as a smile, even if we belong to completely different cultures. Why? On the one hand, there are some hypotheses which are basically post-Darwinian hypotheses. It's the school of Paul Ekman, for instance, who is this scholar who has studied facial emotions and expressions in the United States for a long time. This school and these scholars claim that our facial expressions are universal. So there is a grammar to facial expressions, but these facial expressions are actually universal to all human beings. But there is also an opposite school, which is voiced by mainly anthropologists, for instance Margaret Mead or other anthropologists, who say, okay, maybe we have some universal grammar of facial expressions, but this universal grammar is inflected by local dialects, let's say. And these local dialects are actually culturally specific. They depend on particular cultural conditions. Now, let me give you an example. You see, in internet communication now, we don't use only words, we use also images, and we also use some small images that are particularly important to convey our emotions. So these particular images are very popular also in China, on WeChat for instance. They are called emojis. If I go to the list, the WeChat list that I share with my Chinese colleagues is full of emojis, it's full of roses, it's full of little faces, and so on and so forth. So these faces, these little faces, seek to reproduce in digital visual communication some facial expressions and the relative emotions that would not be easy to convey through verbal language only. So for instance, if I publish on the chat a smiling face with 2 tears, you're gonna all understand that this emoji stays for an open laughter, stays for the fact that I'm having a lot of fun about something. So some of these emojis are actually universal, like the facial expressions and the emotions that they represent. But think about another specific emoji, which is the so-called palm face. The palm face is an emoji that I use when I did something wrong, when I'm embarrassed about something. So the palm face is a little yellow face that appears like this. So it's an expression that we use, a gestural but also facial expression in many cultures, to convey the idea that, oh, I made a big mistake, I'm ashamed about it, I'm embarrassed. It's the palm face. It's called palm face because I have a palm in front of the face. It's something that conveys a very straightforward and even universal meaning. I have a face, but I must cover it because I'm ashamed about something. I did something wrong, so I cannot show my face anymore. But please go on WeChat and observe the emoji that is used in WeChat to convey the idea and the emotions of the palm face. And then, if you can, go to a Western website, go to a Western social network, go to WhatsApp. You cannot go on WhatsApp, but please believe me, and observe the emoji that is used in Western social networks to convey the idea of the palm face. You'll see that there is a difference. There is a big difference. What is the big difference? The palm face in the West is sad. It's like this. The palm face in China, in the East, is smiling. It's like this. You see? It's a small difference. It's a difference between signifiers, a palm face, an emoji, which is sad in the West, and a palm face, an emoji, which is sad, which is smiling in the East. The general universal idea that these two emojis convey is the same. Is the idea I'm embarrassed, is the idea of embarrassment, is the idea of I did something wrong, I made a mistake, I'm ashamed, I cannot show my face must be covered. But there is a difference. In China, even in these conditions of embarrassment, even when one is about to lose one's face because he has made a mistake, the face of the one who has made a mistake is still smiling because it's still calling for an emotional positive empathy on the part of the interlocutor. So it's true that I'm embarrassed, it's true that I'm ashamed, but please keep smiling with me. Please give me an opportunity to save my face. You know, the concept of face is very important in Chinese culture, and actually all the ethnomethodology of the face, the sociology of the face that was developed by Erving Goffman in the 1950s and 1960s in the West was a consequence of the observation of the concept of the face in the culture and the language of China by Western scholars. So there is this universal feeling, there is this universal emotion, but at the same time this grammar of the face is inflected into many different dialects that are so important that they make emojis used in relation to these emotions different, whether we are in the West or in the East. But what is even more important from our point of view is that we can study these little signs, these emojis, these signs representing faces, in order to understand something more about the semiotic ideologies behind them. So what is the semiotic ideology behind the fact that in China the palm face is still smiling, and what is the semiotic ideology behind the fact that the palm face in the West, in Europe, is not smiling? You know, some of the researchers in my group, Professor Gabriele Marino, for instance, who is going to intervene in our seminar, is a specialist on the palm face. He has written on emojis. So this is to give a long answer to your question, but also to convey the idea that you see, artists were those who, before the invention of anatomy, would know the body much better than anybody else, because they would be interested in constructing or reconstructing faces and bodies in their artworks. But also, before and even after the development of the psychology of the face, of the semiotics of the face, artists were also those who would be specialists in knowing the emotions of the face, in how to study them, but also in order to how to represent them. We're going to devote a special lesson, a special class to physiognomy, which is a long tradition, which has a long tradition in the West, but also in China, which is the knowledge developed by human beings about the face, how to study the face in order to know what is behind it, the emotions that are behind the face, the attitudes, but also the personality, and so on and so forth. So yes, Anna Coleman was not a doctor, was not a surgeon, but she knew that the face was very important, that human beings cannot actually live a normal life without a face. You know, we are experiencing it right now with the pandemic and with the aftermaths of the spreading of the COVID-19. You see, in the previous section of the lesson today, I was talking about the new words that have been invented during the pandemic in order to designate new cocktails, new groups, new categories of people, and so on and so forth. There is also a word which is also a neologism, is a word that has been invented during the pandemic, and this word is covidity. Covidity. What is the covidity? Covidity is the ability to express one's emotions, one's intentions, one's feelings while wearing a mask, which is something that is not very common and very easy. You know, when you come across a friend or a colleague face to face, and of course in Italy as well as in other countries you must keep social distance, at least 1 meter or 1.5 meters, but you want to convey to this colleague or to this friend the idea that you are actually happy to see him, you're actually happy to see her. This is not as simple as before, because the part of your face which is the one that we humans traditionally use in order to convey the idea of happiness is covered by the mask. So now for instance I'm smiling, but you cannot see that I'm smiling because my face is covered by my hands, as it is covered by a mask when I come across a person in public. So as a consequence, human beings during these pandemics are developing covidity, so they are developing new ways of using their eyes. So they use their eyes in much more expressive a way. They use their forehead, they use their eyebrows, because they must actually convey the idea that, oh, I'm really happy to see you, you know, because before they wouldn't do so. They overemphasize the emotional content of the upper part of the face, because the lower part of the face is hidden behind a mask. So it is thought as a part of the face that cannot actually convey this meaning anymore. But this is to say that, of course, the pandemic has led to the introduction of new words, and these new words entail a new linguistic ideology, but new systems of non-verbal signs have been introduced as well. So covidity is one of them. We use our eyes, our eyebrows, our forehead in a different way, because they have become the displayed, visible part of our face. So of course in some countries and situations transparent masks have been introduced, especially to suit the needs of deaf mute people, There's a young colleague of mine, Professor Marco Viola, who's studying these new masks, the transparent masks. But in general, the surgical face medical masks that we use, they don't let people see our mouth, which is the main center and the main source of the impression of smiling. But another example, which is also related to the pandemic, you see in many countries, people would signal the fact that they would start a conversation or a dialogue or a communicative interaction with someone, and also they would also signal the fact that they were ending this communicative interaction through mainly non-verbal sign. So this is something that we see, or we would see in Italy as in China. What happens when I come across a colleague in Italy? I usually do not just start talking. I first signal the fact that I've come across a person with whom I actually want to have a communicative interaction by shaking his or her hand. And in Italy, if you know the person very well, in the past you would even kiss the person on the two cheeks. You know, there are different grammars depending on the region and so on and so forth, depending on the gender as well. But now there is no handshake anymore, of course, because it's a possible source of contagion. So people, when they come across, they don't have any opportunity to have physical contact anymore. So they keep distant, but at the same time they cannot shake hand. They must signal the fact that, oh, I'm going to start talking to you in a different way. And in the beginning that was pretty difficult, awkward. Why? Because we were used to these two systems of signs. So the non-verbal system of signs, shaking hands, kissing someone on one's cheeks, would say, okay, I'm going to start talking to you. You are someone whom I know. And then I would start talking using verbal language. And then in order to close the conversation, I would again resort to non-verbal signs, shaking hands again or kissing on someone on the cheeks again. But now all these non-verbal signs of physical contact indicating the beginning or the ending of a conversation are not allowed, or they are strongly discouraged because they can be a vehicle for a contagion. So people must readapt verbal language in order to somehow replace some functions that beforehand were carried on by non-verbal signs, non-verbal language. So we are much more, at least in Europe or in Italy, we are much more expressive in words and also in bodily movements when we come across a person we know and we want to engage in conversation with. Exactly because I cannot shake your hand anymore, exactly because I cannot kiss you anymore, I cannot kiss you goodbye anymore, I resort to wider gestures to say, oh, very nice to meet you, let's see you next week, and so on and so forth. I must change the tone of my voice, the tone of the conversation, which is another technically called paralinguistic element of language. So it's not part of verbal language, it's part of the tone of the voice with which we accompany language. This has changed too. Before colleagues would meet and say, like, shake hand, oh, good morning, Professor Leone, how are you, and so on and so forth. But now they cannot shake hands anymore, so they say, oh, Professor Leone, how are you? Because, of course, they must somehow replace the semiotic force of a handshake with other means. This is something that we live in our everyday life, but we are not constantly aware of it. We are aware of it in the beginning when the pandemic started to be global. Then we realized that many of our habits and communicative behaviors had to change. But little by little, all these adjustments, all these new behaviors, all these new patterns of signification, all these readjustments to conditions that were determined by the pandemic were actually turned into a habit. So new habits are actually being created by the fact that we are under the threat of the virus. And if the pandemic continues, and it will probably continue for a certain time, then these habits will become pretty crystallized, pretty solid. So what do you think? If the pandemic lasts 1 more year, 2 more years, 3 more years, will people afterwards, even after that the vaccination has been found, even after that the virus has been completely eliminated, will people go back to shake hands again? Will people go back to act with their bodies and with their faces as they would in the past? I'm not so sure. It depends. If the pandemic lasts for a very long time, it's very severe, semiotic habits will change somehow also permanently. Children who are born during the pandemic, who will be in school, in the kindergarten or in infants schools, in the first years of their experience of education, will actually learn these new habits which have been determined by the pandemic as their natural habits. They're interiorized as social habits, deeply ingrained, deep-seated in their semiotic and natural behavior, in their second nature, because it's not natural behavior in the natural science meaning of the term. Is a second nature, is an acquired nature. They will, of course, consider that shaking hands is something that is as awkward to them as not shaking hands is awkward to us. So habits change, and these habits turn into grammars, not only for what concerns verbal language, but also other kinds of languages, visual languages, the language of the body, postures, distance between people. There is a specific branch of semiotics which has been developed mainly by a British scholar, T.S. Hall, which is called proxemics. Proxemics is the branch of semiotics that studies the social meaning of distance. Proxemics is changing everywhere in the world. The social meaning of the distance between people, and objects, is also changing around the world. But what is the difference between the grammar of distance and the grammar of Chinese language? What is the difference between the grammar of the face and the grammar of Italian language? Can we call both of them grammars? They are grammars in the same way. Well, not exactly in the same way, and this is the second part to my answer, which is a long answer because actually it has been turned into the second part of our meeting today. When we talk about the grammar of the Chinese language, we are talking about a set of rules that are highly standardized and are also codified into some meta texts, like handbooks of grammar that are used in schools, in high schools, in universities. Now, in certain countries there are even academies of language, the Academy of Chinese Language or the Academy of Italian Language, that preside exactly over the rules, codes and grammars that are an indispensable, implicit and explicit knowledge to be the speaker of a certain community. We don't have the same grammar as regards faces, as regards images, as regards postures. We don't have an Italian Academy of Italian gestural language. Now, you know that Italians use many gestures, and some of these gestures are actually codified. These gestures in Italian means I don't care, I don't care. These gestures means it's good, especially for food, it's good, and so on and so forth. So many gestures are codified in Italian, but there is no Academy of Italian Gestures, because the grammar of Italian gestures is part of a common language which is not codified. It is not actually as codified as verbal language, the grammar of verbal language is. Now you will say, yeah, but the grammar of verbal language changes too. Of course it changes. And modern academies of language, present-day academies of language, do not properly have an exclusively normative function. So their main function is not to say, okay, you can say that, you cannot say that. They do so, but they also operate according to the awareness that grammar is a product of society. Society changes and grammar changes as well. It changes slowly, but it changes. You don't speak Chinese today as you should speak it 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. You don't write German or Spanish today as you would write Spanish or German 20 years ago, because in the meantime the writing system of both German and Spanish have been changed. In some circumstances, countries even changed their alphabet. Turkey, after Atatürk's revolution, changed from using the Arabic script to using the Latin script, and so on and so forth. So languages change. Sometimes they change even in depth, even in their syntactic structures. Nevertheless, this change is slow, and it is not so rapid as to jeopardize the awareness of the solidity of verbal language and its grammar. So we all human beings, we all speakers have the idea that grammar is somehow there. The grammar of verbal language is something that allows me in most circumstances to determine whether I'm actually saying something with the proper syntax or not. The same cannot be said about other systems of science. Other systems of science do not produce the same crystallized, solidified, stable grammars. The grammar of clothes, for instance, should I wear a shirt with a tie or not? If I were a professor in Italy 50 years ago, it would be unthinkable that I present myself to you, my students, with my open necktie and without a tie on, because the grammar of academic dressing, the dressing code of the academe, let's say up to the 1950s and 1960s in Italy as in other countries, would actually require that the professor wears a tie when he meets his students or her students, but mostly his students. And this has changed, and this changes very rapidly. Nowadays, if you go to a European university, you will come across professors with a tie, professors without a tie, professors with long hair, professors with short hair, and so on and so forth. So this is not standardized as highly as in detail as other systems of science are. Nevertheless, although we cannot grasp the grammar of faces, the grammar of clothes, the grammar of gestures as easily and as definitely as we can grasp the grammar of verbal languages, we can nevertheless study these systems of science in order to understand how they evolve, why they change, what is implied by this change in terms of the meaning of these changing signs, but also in terms of the causes, the implicit ideological causes of the change. What is it, for instance, that has pushed Italian professors not to wear a tie anymore? It's not only fashion. it's also something else. It is a certain ideology of teaching. It is a certain ideology of hierarchy and distance between the teacher and the student. So now the professor is supposed not to show too much distance to and from the student. So the dressing code has become less formal accordingly. So you see, these are all signs that we can collect, and we must learn to collect systematically according to a certain methodology in order to understand more than they apparently convey, in order to understand what is it that hides behind a new gesture, a new facial expression, a new emoji, a new way of dressing, clothes that change in their shape, in their color, in the position they have with their body, and so on and so forth. You see, the poster that is in my back, I told you that is a poster of a famous movie, La Dolce Vita, by a famous Italian director, Federico Fellini. But you see, an element there would never appear in a poster, in a movie poster nowadays. In Italy nowadays, you would not see such a poster anymore. Why? This is a question to you. What is it in this poster that you would not see nowadays? What is it that would be impossible to see? This poster is a famous poster, Rotella poster from the 1960s. A poster for a movie nowadays would never, under any circumstance, include someone smoking, someone with a cigarette in his lips. In the past, if you see French or Italian movies of the 1950s, 1960s, characters were smoking all the time. Actors and actresses were smoking all the time. Also university professors were smoking all the time. If you go back and see the videos of the seminars that Umberto Eco would give in Bologna in the 1970s, that Roland Barthes would give in Paris in the 1960s, of the seminars given by Sartre or by very famous French philosophers, they were all smoking. Students were smoking, everybody was smoking. People were smoking in movie theaters. But now, of course, this has become forbidden in many countries. But it is not only a legal change, it is not only a normative change, something else has changed as well. Also, an entire culture has changed and has turned what was a symbol of distinction, a symbol of seduction, a symbol of cool, the fact of smoking, into a symbol of death, into a symbol of being a poisonous for oneself, but also for other people, for society. So you see, as semioticians, we must pay attention to everything, because everything might mean, and everything might mean actually more than what it appears to mean. As a semiotician, we develop something which is sort of a semiotic microscope. You know, it's not a microscope that allows us to see objects that are too small for the human eye, but it's a semiotic microscope that allows us to see the implications of signs that are used and circulate in everyday life. It is a microscope that allows us to understand the secret inner rules that pattern the circulation of meaning in a certain human community. So I hope we have advanced a little bit more in the understanding of the difference between language ideology, semiotic ideology, and the relation between verbal language and non-verbal language in the study of culture. Now we're going to take another short break of 10 minutes, and after these 10 minutes Professor Jenny Ponceo will appear on screen. Professor Jenny Ponceo is a professor who specializes in the semiotics of literature, the semiotics of religion. She has won a very prestigious grant, a European grant, that allows her to have her own research group. She has many publications in English and in other languages, and she's also the president of our course in communication studies at the University of Turin, as well as director of the Center of Research, Interdisciplinary Research on Communication at the University of Turin. So I please ask Dr. Niesi Chang to unmute her, so to give her the possibility to be the main speaker after the break, so that she might give her talk, her 15 minutes talk on the semiotic ideologies of literature, and then after another 10 minutes from about 10:50 to 11:40, we're going to have a discussion. So thank you very much for these two first sections. We're going to have a 10 minutes break, and after the break, Professor Jenny Ponceo will have the floor and deliver a talk. Of course, I'm going to be in the audience. Thank you very much.